The Royal Navy's Carrier Strike Group has just entered the Indo-Pacific to project a British strategic presence, uphold a free and open international order, and to support allies and partners. It marks the most significant deployment of British naval power in a generation. On arrival in the region, British warships are expected to partake in freedom of navigation maneuvers so as to negate the PRC's excessive or illegitimate maritime claims and uphold international maritime law. Earlier this week, we published an explainer on this very topic by Dr. Bill Hayton. His analysis assesses the geostrategic significance of the Carrier Strike Group's movements in the South China Sea in the wider context of the prevailing regional security environment, and also evaluates external responses to it, particularly China's. And today we have a wonderful opportunity to discuss this topic with our prominent panelists. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Chris Parry, James Rogers, Dr. Bill Hayton, and Tran. Dr. Chris Parry has served with distinctions in the Falklands War, being mentioned in dispatches for his heroic deeds. His naval career began in 1972, and by 1989, he had risen to the command of HMS Gloucester. He was involved in the incapacitation of the Argentine submarine Santa Fe during the Falklands War. In 2005, he was promoted to Rear Admiral when he took over as Director General of the Development Concepts and Doctrine Center. Since leaving the Royal Navy in 2008, he has worked in the private sector as a writer, broadcaster, and public speaker. We are also joined by Dr. Bill Hayton, who is an Associate Fellow with the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House, and has worked as a journalist with BBC News since 1998. He was the BBC's reporter in Vietnam in 2006 and 2007, and spent a year seconded to the state broadcaster in Myanmar in 2013 and 2014, working on media development. He focuses on the South China Sea dispute and current affairs in Southeast Asia, and he has briefed government departments, officials, and companies in the UK, the USA, Europe, and Asia, as well as written for numerous media outlets on Asia-Pacific matters. We are also joined by Tran, who is an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and also a PhD scholar at the University of Antwerp. Her research interests include Vietnam's grand strategy, Southeast Asian states' relations with major powers, and political leadership. She is also a fellow at Verve Research, specializing in Vietnam security and foreign policy. Previously, she was a visiting research fellow at the Global Affairs Research Center, the East-West Center, and Rutsumaken Center for Asia-Pacific Studies. She is the author of From Rebalance to Asia to Free and Open Indo-Pacific, among other publications. And finally, we are joined by James Rogers, who is a co-founder and director of research at the Council on Geostrategy. He specializes in geopolitics and British strategic policy. So before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules. Our panelists will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and James Rogers will start the speeches. His speech will be followed by Dr. Bill Hayton, Dr. Chris Parry, and Tran. The event will end with a Q&A session, and I encourage you to ask your questions during the whole course of the event, but please do make sure that you indicate your name, affiliation, and to whom you are addressing your question. So without any further delay, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. So I thought I would start my intervention with a few comments explaining why the Carrier Strike Group has been deployed into the region, into the Indo-Pacific, and what it is going to do. So the Carrier Strike Group has been more than 20 years in the making in many ways, because the decision to procure 2 large aircraft carriers was made in the 1998 Strategic Defence Review. The design and construction of the lead ship, HMS Queen Elizabeth, has taken almost 20 years, with the vessel being commissioned in late 2017. The current strike group, which was put together earlier this year, includes 9 vessels, of which 2 are foreign, allied, one being Dutch and the other being a US vessel. In addition to the British aircraft on board, there are also a number of US F-35B aircraft that are supporting the operation. So the big question is, why is the Carrier Strike Group being deployed to the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea in particular? I think there are 6 reasons for this. The first is to contribute to the visual manifestation of the United Kingdom's Indo-Pacific tilt, the tilt being outlined in the integrated review that was published in March this year. The idea of an Indo-Pacific tilt is to embrace the idea that the Indo-Pacific is now the center of gravity economically in the world and increasingly geopolitically, and therefore the UK as an international actor needs to be involved in that key region. This doesn't mean that the Euro-Atlantic, Britain's home region, is any less important, only that the Indo-Pacific is an area of focus and there is an increasing interconnectivity between the two regions. So it's surely no surprise in that context that the Ministry of Defence announced the deployment of 2 Royal Navy patrol vessels, HMS Spey and HMS Tamar, for later this year, just as the Carrier Strike Group was moving into the Indo-Pacific region. Therefore, this manifests or demonstrates visually Britain's commitment to the region and its continued focus on the Indo-Pacific. I think the second reason for the deployment of the Carrier Strike Group is to demonstrate Britain's sheer military capability. Although we should not be too brash, who else other than the United States has the ability now to deploy such a large carrier strike group equipped with 5th generation combat jets to the other side of the world and to keep it in theatre, working with allies and partners for several months? This is an important question as we contemplate Britain's future and the future of the region, i.e. the Indo-Pacific in general. The third reason I think the Carrier Strike Group is being deployed to the region is to develop, demonstrate and achieve the ability to lead and operate alongside the most important maritime powers in the 21st century, whether in the Euro-Atlantic or in the Indo-Pacific. Chief among these, at least in an Indo-Pacific context, are the United States and Japan, but also India, South Korea, Thailand and the countries of the 5 power defence arrangements, that is to say Australia, Malaysia, New Zealand and Singapore. All of those countries have welcomed the presence of the Carrier Strike Group in the region as a contributor to regional security, and Britain will be exercising with those over the coming weeks and months to ensure the greatest degree of interoperability. The fourth reason, I think, is to demonstrate the extent of Britain's geostrategic reach in a more volatile and competitive era. This gives animation to one of the background ideas of the integrated review and the Defence Command paper, namely that of forward deterrence. This is the idea that the British military and diplomatic assets need to be more broadly and forwardly deployed to dissuade potential and to deter actual geopolitical revisionists from contemplating hostile actions, not least the People's Republic of China in the South China Sea. The fifth reason I think that the Carrier Strike Group has been deployed is to uphold freedom of navigation and to contribute to maintaining what the integrated review describes as an open international order. This is, of course, related to the previous point I just made. Again, if the UK does not step up and uphold openness, who else other than the United States will? And finally, the sixth reason I think the Carrier Strike Group has been deployed is to show support for the other 4 5-power defence arrangements partners, not least in the Strategic Group's 50th anniversary year. The Carrier Strike Group is expected to participate in exercises alongside the navies of Australia, Singapore, Malaysia and New Zealand during the autumn as it moves further into the region. So those are the 6 key reasons I think the Carrier Strike Group has been deployed into the Indo-Pacific. And now we will hear, I think, more from Bill Hayton as to how the Chinese might perceive of its presence.
Great. Thank you very much, James. And thank you for the invitation to write the paper and to join everybody today. And thanks to Victoria for chairing and my fellow panelists for their contributions. We are in what journalists sometimes call the silly season, the time of year in August when Parliament stops sitting and people go on holiday and there aren't so many substantial stories to fill the newspapers. But newspapers still need to be filled. Thankfully, journalists this year have the Olympics, at least for a couple of weeks, but editors are going to need a lot more to fill their pages and airtime. And the arrival of the Carrier Strike Group, which has been trailed literally for years on its journey to Asia, which means It's in everybody's news gathering diaries, and guests have been arranged and all that kind of thing. So the anticipation is there. And now all that's required is a series of stories to turn this event into headlines and column inches. Obviously, when you have headlines and you need to attract viewers, the more dramatic the story, the more exciting the headline, the better. Journalists have to convince their own editors to go with stories, and editors have to be convinced that their readers are going to be excited and interested enough to read and to buy these stories. So they need drama. So we're likely to see words like threat, clash, conflict, maybe even war would appear in a headline to try and get stories commissioned by editors and then read by readers. But I do wonder whether in this case, this might be the most appropriate headline that we should see: shock as ship sails through sea. Because really, to some extent, it's a normal activity. Ships sail through seas, even warships go through seas from time to time, seas in different parts of the world. And this is a right that's guaranteed even to warships under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They're even allowed to sail through territorial seas close to coasts, as long as they do so on the basis of what's called innocent passage. Now, there are lots of wrinkles in international law which people might want to ask about, but that's the general principle that I think we need to be aware of when framing these stories. The South China Sea, just a very quick geography for those of you who don't know. The Paracel Islands are these ones up here in the northern part of the sea, entirely occupied by China, but claimed by Vietnam over here. The Spratlys down here, more than half are occupied by Vietnam, but China also claims all of them, has 7 large bases, including 3 with 3-kilometer long runways on them. Philippines occupies about 10, Malaysia about 5, and Brunei claims 1 but doesn't occupy it. And there are 2 sets of legal disputes really about these islands. Firstly, it's about the rocks and reefs, who is the rightful owner of them, and that's basically between the countries around the edges of the sea. And then there are the maritime disputes, which rules apply in the spaces in between the rocks and the reefs. And so what the UK will be doing, if it does any of this, if it challenges any of China's claims, it will not be challenging anybody's territorial claims about who owns which rock and reef, but it will be challenging infringements of the rule, where it sees infringements of the rules about, for example, freedom of navigation of warships to go from point A to point B across the sea. But it's worth remembering that China makes use of the rights of freedom of navigation quite often. Here is, in the middle is the destroyer Xi'an, passing through the English Channel in August 2019, a couple of years ago. It went through British territorial waters. It was monitored, as you can see, by a British warship, but in no sense was it harassed or hindered. And Britain didn't put out any statement saying that our sovereignty had been infringed or threatened, or that the UK had expelled the Chinese warship, even though it sailed past our main naval bases at Portsmouth and Plymouth and places like that. 2 years before, 3 Chinese warships had sailed through the English Channel. These are pictures that were released by the Dutch Navy when those 3 warships sailed through. And on both occasions, the Chinese vessels were going to the Baltic to take part in military exercises with Russia. And then they came back. So 4 transits in total. There are many problems to do with China's claims in the South China Sea, and Bich will talk about how regional countries perceive them, and they're mainly to do with resources, fish and oil and gas and that kind of thing. But from the UK's perspective, what's worrying is when China draws lines in the sea and says that other countries' ships can't go through them. And one of these areas is the Paracel Islands in the northern part of the South China Sea. And in 2018, HMS Albion made a symbolic transit through this area to demonstrate the UK's objections to China's restrictions here. Now, a little bit of legal background. China has drawn these baselines around the islands. The law of the sea, UNCLOS, allows this, but says that the ratio between land and water in such a situation cannot be more than 9-to-1. So 9 parts water, and 1 part land. In the paracels, the ratio is 1,898-to-1. So you can clearly see how illegitimate these lines are. China claims them as internal waters and says that other countries can't go inside them. The fear from the UK's perspective is that China might try to do the same line drawing in other parts of the South China Sea, in the Spratlys or in central areas as well. And so if the UK does this again, this will be a sort of a kind of a protest against China's attempts to reduce freedom of navigation in these contexts. So that's the kind of the legal background. Now, in terms of how China will kind of frame this, at the very least, we're going to see comments about Chinese warships and expelling the British. In fact, I think we've already seen this, I think in a Global Times article that James helpfully tweeted out this morning. There will be no expelling. The ship will sail through unless the Chinese deliberately try to provoke a confrontation. All they will do will radio one another, and the ships will sail on through. There may be some sort of buzzing of the ship perhaps, but I would not expect there to be any kind of physical confrontation unless China wishes to make it so. But expel kind of sounds dramatic. But it's, I think, important to see how this is being framed from the Chinese perspective. The Chinese embassy on Tuesday issued a statement calling the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace's speech in Vietnam, which he gave over the weekend, wrong remarks, was in the phrase of the Chinese embassy, saying that Mr. Wallace had disregarded the objective facts of the South China Sea and undermined regional peace and stability. And this, I think, is going to be another framing that Britain, by sailing the carrier strike group, is undermining regional peace and stability. Well, in that case, I think we need to explain why the UK carrier strike group has been invited to take part in joint exercises with Malaysia and Singapore, and is making a port visit in Brunei. And I imagine would be doing more port visits if it were not for the COVID situation. I imagine that the Vietnamese are quite happy to see the British carrier group sail through the region, because they are keen to have any kind of support in what they regard as their struggle for peace and stability against China, really. I mean, it's a latent dispute, but it's one that has meant that Vietnam has been unable, for example, to develop some of its offshore oil and gas resources because of China's protests. We are seeing plenty of other comments, and the standard tropes which get wheeled out tend to be ones that make references to Britain's historical imperial past, a past that ended long ago. Britain gave up its colonies in Malaysia and Singapore 60 years ago. Brunei became fully independent in 1984. Any kind of, or the defense relationships that Britain now has with those countries are the choices of independent governments who do so for their own reasons. They're not beholden to a colonial master. But it seems that China is unable to kind of incorporate within its public discourse the idea that its neighbors and smaller countries will have any problem with Chinese behavior. And so therefore, these things are always framed as bigger countries, the United States being the biggest of them all, simply stirring the pot and causing these countries to take wrong positions against China. I think that's rather patronizing to these countries who are perfectly able to make their own decisions. So I think the common response really here is to see the best way to respond to this is to see how these smaller and medium-sized countries in the region are making use of the carrier strike group's visit and passes in their own interest, and to kind of frame the region in that sense, rather than in some kind of Opium War 3 scenario where this is Britain coming and waving a big stick at China. This is Britain being part of a community of countries which all have concerns about the fate of international law and regional peace and security, and want to stand together to do something to preserve it. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayton. And Dr. Parry, over to you. But before you start your speech, I would like to remind everyone once again that you can start asking your questions now. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground there. So what I'll try and do is just pick and highlight some of the issues that came out of that. I think it's right to stress that this carrier deployment was planned a long time ago. But what it's morphed into is an expression of global Britain as expressed by the current government. And global Britain effectively means global maritime Britain. And the investment in the Royal Navy and the investment in our maritime enterprises right now reflects the government's ability to say, if we are going to be global, then it has to be at sea. It reflects the idea that the sea is essentially the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. If you're not at sea, you're not into globalization, you're not into contact with your allies, your partners, your investments, or indeed your interests, wherever they may be found. The carrier deployment, as James has already hinted, is also an expression of a return in some ways to the Anglosphere. Although we've given up our empire, we've got a lot of contacts in the English-speaking world and those that also sit on the rim of it: Malaysia, Brunei, Australia, New Zealand. And I'd even put Japan in that bracket as well, because they're part of that sort of international grouping. It's also reinforcing the international system, UN Convention Law of the Sea, which of course underpins the system of globalization that we have today. And one of the things that the UK very surreptitiously challenges is the fact that the artificial structures on the paracels and spratlys don't have any status under UNCLOS at all. They're reclaimed, they're specifically excluded from UNCLOS on that basis, they're artificial, and they don't of themselves sustain life. So even the islands themselves are illegitimate. But where the British now frame things after the integrated review is essentially a hint and an implication that the world is dividing into two blocks. And that is the Eurasian autocrats, which are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and the maritime democracies. So typically United States, China, parts of Europe, not all of it, India, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and anybody else who wants to join the club. And this is a classic geopolitical laydown between what Mackinder thought about the world island, Eurasia, and Mahan, the world ocean. And the bits that we'll be contesting will be in Nicholas Spikeman's Rimland, those countries that exist between Mahanian world ocean and the Mackinder world island. And we shouldn't forget that in looking back in history, Chinese strategy right now looks a lot like the Ming strategy of the 16th century. They're looking to create a trade and tribute hub in the Asia-Pacific, such as protected by Zheng He, and the maritime elements of the Belt and Road Initiative look awfully like the voyages that Zheng He used to undertake in the early 15th century. And so for the Western democracies, they want to ensure that the autocracies don't close down and control the sea around Eurasia. And what we're seeing with the Carrier Strike Group is an ability to bring together coordinated action and political will in the face of Chinese adventurism and expansionism. And this is the world that Britain envisaged in the integrated review and the associated documents. Now, there's one big snag. We're getting confused signals now from the United States. A recent speech by Lloyd Austin said that actually Britain should concentrate on the western end of the Eurasian continent and let the United States concentrate on the Pacific. Well, I think there's a real problem in framing it that way. A, because it is a US against China relationship. And secondly, I think it reflects an attitude in America right now that says that in local areas, countries should look after their own security problems in a way that I think has indicated a subtle shift. In the past, if there was a problem in a local area that the local area couldn't cope with, the sheriff, that is the Americans, used to put together some deputies. They'd go off and deal with the problem. We used to call it a coalition, and everybody would go home afterwards. Now, today, what I'm thinking the Biden administration wants to have is that local and regional partners basically group together, sort out whether it's in Europe or in Asia, and if necessary, the cavalry will be sent, maybe, if you actually do enough for your own defense and things like that. I think it's confused at the moment. Britain isn't prepared to wait until that debate has been settled. It has its own interests, as I said, and I think it's very unhealthy to frame the issue as a US v China issue. Fact of life is, the United States can't even cope with that in the Pacific militarily. Very quickly on Chinese reactions, I think I'd like to bring to the fore the lens of narratives and audiences. We've already seen, if you like, the dress rehearsal for this with HMS Defender in the Black Sea. This is going to be a shouting rather than a shooting war in the Asia Pacific. China's tendency, I think, the way I view it internally, is to play it down. They really don't want to demonstrate to their people they can't keep the Brits out. I think there'll be a lot of surveillance. There'll be photo opportunities of Chinese ships and submarines in the vicinity of the carrier strike group. And the implication will be the Brits are there by permission of the Chinese. We're letting it happen. Externally, I agree with Bill here. I think China will want to project the insignificance of the UK carrier task group. It's not permanent. It's not like the United States carriers in the Pacific. They're going to go away from one day. And I'm afraid these mixed messages from the US Secretary of Defense are going to assist the Chinese in this respect. The only time I think there'll be trouble is if the carrier strike group crosses red lines. They're not going to go through the Taiwan Strait, but if they do, that'll be a problem. I think if they poke at the Paracels and Spratlys, there'll be some reaction. I think there'll be some mild harassment of the carriers flying operations by so-called fishing vessels manned by the maritime militia, and I think a swarming tactic will be used in those circumstances. And I think we'll see a lot of tests of the international rules for preventing collision at sea, just as we saw during the Cold War with Russia. If there's any sort of publicity to be gained, I think we'll see the Chinese trying to isolate and harass individual units, not the carrier itself, and show just how much threatening power they can bring to bear. And it'll be a mimic incident. If we can do this to a British carrier, we can do it to an American one as well. So perhaps I'll leave it there and we can have a discussion during questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parry, for your insights. And Tran, over to you. Tran, I'm so sorry. I'm afraid we can't hear you. You're muted. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Victoria, for the introduction, and many thanks to the Council on Geostrategy for the opportunity to share some thoughts. So as many countries, including the United States and its allies, have conducted FONOPs to challenge excessive claims, I would like to talk a little more about what excessive claims mean, adding to what Dr. Hayton and Dr. Parry already mentioned. An excessive claim can be trust-based lies not drawn in accordance with the law of the sea, or prior permission required for innocent passage of foreign military ships through the territorial sea. It can be a claim to security jurisdiction in the contiguous zone, or domestic law that criminalizing survey activity by foreign entities in the exclusive economic zone. It can also be actions and statements that indicate a claim to a territorial areas that around surrounding features not so entitled, for example, low tide elevation or artificial islands. Excessive claims also mean restrictions on foreign aircraft flying through an air defense identification zone without the intention to enter national airspace, or jurisdiction over airspace above the exclusive economic zones. In fact, China has all of the 7 excessive claims listed above. Besides China, US FONOPs have targeted many South Asian countries. but not just in the South China Sea. For example, US warships have challenged Burma's claim in Andaman Sea, Cambodia's and Thailand's claims in the Gulf of Thailand, Indonesia's claim in Lombok Strait, Malaysia's claim in the Strait of Malacca, and the Philippines' claim in Sulu Sea. And regarding excessive claims in the South China Sea, US FONOPS challenged Malaysia's requirement of prior consent for military exercise in the exclusive economic zone, and Vietnam's Strait Bay lines, as well as prior notification required for foreign warships to enter the territorial sea. So, as we are talking about UK carrier strike groups' presence in the South China Sea, I will focus on potential reactions from Malaysia and Vietnam because they are the two countries whose claims in the South China Sea might be challenged by the naval group. But before that, I would like to talk a little bit about the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. One of the four key elements is an Indo-Pacific region of dialogue and cooperation instead of rivalry. On this point, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, "One of the things we will be doing clearly is showing to our friends in China that we believe in international law of the sea, and in a confident but not a confrontational way, we will vindicating that point." So I think UK message of non-confrontational is in line with the ASEAN outlook. The second element of the outlook is the importance of maritime domain. The ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific is based on the principles of respect for international law, including UNCLOS, and promotion of freedom of navigation and overflight. So for Malaysia, I couldn't find any official statement from the Malaysian government commenting on FONOPS by Western powers in the South China Sea. However, in its joint statement with China in 2018, Malaysia emphasized the importance of maintaining peace and security and stability, as well as freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. And besides freedom of navigation, Malaysia also promotes freedom of overflight above the South China Sea in its joint statement with the Philippines in 2019 and with Australia in 2020. The press statement on the South China Sea by Malaysian Minister of Foreign Affairs on April 23, 2020 reads, "While international law guarantees the freedom of navigation, the presence of warships and vessels in the South China Sea has the potential to increase tensions that in turn may result in miscalculations, which may affect peace, security, and stability in the regions." So this means that Malaysia is cautious in its approach. As for Vietnam, when asked about US FONOPS in the South China Sea in 2016, the spokesperson of Vietnamese Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, "Vietnam respects the right of innocent passage in the territorial sea to be exercised in accordance with relevant provisions of international law, including UNCLOS." And in 2018, after a British warship has passed the Paracel Islands, Vietnam's spokesperson said, "Vietnam respects the right to freedom of navigation and overflight of other countries in the East Sea, meaning the South China Sea, in accordance with international law, particularly UNCLOS." So in fact, Vietnam has reiterated the same statement every year since 2017. However, Vietnam's statements always include a call for all countries to make active and practical contribution to maintaining peace and stability. So in short, if Southeast Asian states issue statements regarding the UK carrier strike group's activities in the South China Sea, they are likely to support freedom of navigation and overflight on the one hand, and call for peace and stability on the other. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tran. And now it's time to start our Q&A session. So the first question is from Michael Greenfield, who is from Sky News. The carrier strike group is already in the South China Sea en route to the Philippine Sea, but will return through it in the autumn. So when do you think we'll see the most interaction between the British and Chinese? Dr. Parry.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think as long as the deployment goes without any hiccups in the first phase, we might want to consider that towards the end of the second part of the deployment, the Chinese will want to make a demonstration of seeing the carrier group off the premises, because I think the internal message is that the carrier is here by permission of the Chinese people, but when it comes to leave, we'd like to make a demonstration to show that we've actually said it's not welcome. I think there'll be a minor demonstration towards the end. I think the Chinese leadership will have a look and see exactly what the impact and the irritation level of the carrier strike group is in the first phase. And depending on what happens, for example, if the carrier strike group interacts too closely with the Japanese, for example, they'll want to make a sort of statement for the narrative towards the end. But I think the key issue will be to see the carrier off the premises.
Thank you. Dr. Hayton.
Don't think the carriers out of the South China Sea yet. This is just I saw this on Twitter just a few minutes ago. This is a satellite photograph taken at 3 o'clock this morning, London time, and it shows the carrier between the Vietnamese coast and Brunei. So only just entering the area that China claims or draws the U-shaped line around it. So there's still time for plenty of time for things to happen. And bearing in mind, of course, what we've been hearing about there are 9 different vessels in the group, all doing different things at different times. So doesn't mean that the first pass of the South China Sea is going to be uneventful. Things may yet happen. Who knows? I mean, I agree with Chris's assessment that maybe it'll be time to maybe the return journey will be when we see more things happen. But yeah, just so that people know where we are in the current situation.
Thank you. James?
Yes, I think I agree with Chris's and Bill's analysis of that situation. So the group is only just getting into the South China Sea, or the south of the South China Sea now. It will be several hours, if not more, until it reaches anywhere, such as the Paracel Islands, which is to the north of the South China Sea, where some kind of interaction between the carrier strike group and Chinese vessels might occur. And even if that were the case, I suspect that the British have thought this through a little and will do a lighter, if they're going to do something, to do a lighter thing to start off with, and then if necessary, a more robust statement on the way back, so that escalation is avoided in that sense, and it also creates, it controls the narrative and the ability of the Chinese to respond.
Thank you. Ms. Tran?
Yeah, I think that maybe for now we can wait a little more to see what happens.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Leah, who's from Voice of America Mandarin. And her question is for all the panelists. Dr. Hayton, you said in your remarks that this is not opium war free, but UK being part of a community of countries upholding the international law. But to the average Chinese, this looks like the West ganging up against a rising China, reminding them of the painful history of China being bullied by the power allied forces. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman also asked the US to stop using values as a pretext for group confrontation. But Chinese propaganda aside, how do we convince the Chinese citizens that what the West is doing is in their interest?
Good question. Well, I mean, bearing in mind, when we talk about the 8-nation alliance, we're talking about the Boxer Rebellion, which was 1900, so 120 odd years ago. I mean, the idea that somehow we're still locked in the same pattern of a Boxer rising against Westerners living in the then Qing Empire, causing a military intervention to try and rescue those Europeans is, that's clearly nothing like the same situation. But of course, the problem is, when you have a state media and you block out other messages through a great firewall, it's very hard, I guess, to speak to the Chinese people about what's really going on. I mean, my view on this is that I think China's actions in the South China Sea are self-defeating in the strategic sense. If China's desire is to be liked and respected as an upholder of rules and a friend to its neighbors, then it should stop doing the things that upset its neighbors and other members of the international community, and do to others what it would like to be done to itself, i.e. kind of respecting these rules and so forth. So that would be my response, is to kind of, these historical tropes, Opium War, Boxer Rebellion, they're part of the Communist Party's own narrative about why it's the legitimate ruler of China now, because it saves China from the depredations of the past. And so trying to unpick those narratives is, in a way, trying to unpick the Communist Party's legitimacy. So I think that would be very difficult to try and do for the Chinese public as a whole. But I think the messaging beyond that needs to be that this is a new time and these are new issues.
Thank you. Ms. Tran, would you have anything to add?
Yes, so I think that because China's control over the media inside China now, so the average Chinese people, maybe they don't have a lot of access to other sources of information. So in order to convince them, we need to, I don't think we can change anything right now, but maybe it comes to individual levels, like Chinese people understand that they need to look somewhere else for information, and maybe read the paper by Dr. Hayton, and they will understand a lot.
Thank you. James?
Yes, I mean, both Bit and Bill have said, that China is a closed political system in that sense, and things that the Chinese Communist Party don't want the people of China to hear will not be heard. So it will be difficult. But I think it could be said, that there are a number of people from China overseas. So these messages can be projected in international media by the UK. So one of the things I think I would be I would like to see pointed out is the fact that when Chinese vessels have entered into, the Strait of Dover back in 2017 and 2019, the UK didn't behave in an irresponsible way. Yes, it may have sent warships to shadow the Chinese vessels in the way that any other country would do, but it didn't behave hysterically by, saying that it had expelled them or sending aircraft up to buzz them or to make the UK's presence felt. I think it's just a case of communicating, that the UK is responding in a specific way and expects the Chinese government, to hold up to international standards as well. And that's a really important point that can be made in the international media, or indeed by British diplomatic staff when they're speaking in China, so that it would reach a larger audience, particularly those that they might be speaking to that are perhaps at the upper echelons of the Chinese political establishment.
Thank you. Dr. Parry?
Yeah, I think it's important to say to China, we are ganging up on you, because the deal was, in the past, your rise was enabled and facilitated by the West giving you a lot of leeway, joining the WTO, doing all sorts of things. But the gentleman's agreement was that you would become a responsible partner. You're not being a responsible partner at the moment, and this is what happens. Democracies don't like aggressive expansionism and all sorts of threats against Australia and the other countries. And this is designed to say to China, you are a giant. You're rather like Gulliver. You're being tied down here because we don't appreciate the international system from which you have benefited and which we've enabled for you being overturned simply because of the ambitions of your current ruling clique. Well, in fact, one person, in fact. And so, yes, if that's the message that China's got, that's fine, because I know from my Sun Tzu that weakness is a provocation. And the Chinese won't appreciate actually having to face countries that will weaken and appease them. They don't know how to deal with that except dominate them. And so what the democracies are saying is, we've had enough of this. You're pressing on India's borders. You're illegally and illegitimately operating the South China Sea. You're threatening Japan. You're threatening Australia. That's not the way the system works, and we don't want it to work like that. So if that's the message China's getting, then as Bill has hinted, it's your own fault. Just behave better.
I think we've lost Victoria. So perhaps we will answer the question next by Natalie Bennett. She would like to know whether this mission should be weighed against the slashing of overseas development aid policies and whether this fits in with the Sustainable Development Goals, and whether the whole world, including the UK, which signed up to those, and how this fits with the UK being a COP26 chair in 2021. So I will refrain from answering this question at the moment. Maybe I could hand it over to, I don't know, let's start with Bill, maybe.
Great question. And where do you start? I mean, how does a government decide where to spend its money? How does it, building an aircraft carrier is a decision that got sort of started, what did you say, 98? So we're in a kind of 15-year time frame. Its service life will go on for decades to come. It will all cost money. We need a rules-based order. The UN itself, is part of this framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. We need, for example, to manage fish stocks sustainably and cooperatively. And at the moment, Chinese fishing vessels are going around hoovering up the fish from the seas of other countries, regardless of UNCLOS obligations. We are responding to the concerns of the various countries in the region. It would be nice if everybody agreed to play nice, but I just don't see that that's what's developing out there in East Asia. China is not exactly a kind of player when it comes to greening the world. I mean, the amount of coal as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, that kind of thing. I mean, it's not like we can kind of see goodies and baddies here. There's shades of everything. So I kind of see this as, part of the defense of a rules-based order in the hope of preventing a kind of anarchic world where it's just big countries threatening small countries. Kind of exactly how you dovetail that with ending world hunger and controlling pandemics, and it's part of it. But Britain is the fifth or the sixth largest economy in the world. There must be more money around to spend on other things too.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. I think we've got Victoria back. I do apologise for these technical difficulties. Victoria, we were just answering one of the questions on the sort of difference between the green agenda and sending a carrier strike group into the Indo-Pacific. So maybe Chris would like to give us his thoughts on this issue.
Thank you, James.
Yeah. Thanks very much for the question. One of the issues with this is in upholding the international system, I'm hoping that it'll uphold also every other aspect of international cooperation. I don't think it's an either or. I think we've got to take these things forward together. But before we can make decisions amongst partners and amongst people in the world, we're going to have to assure ourselves that the international geostrategic system is stable and that we're all working in the same direction. Just as an aside, I wrote the concept for this carrier back in '98, and in fact, I envisaged it being a nuclear-powered carrier. So it would have been much greener had they gone down the route that I wanted, and in fact, more sustainable. But there we go. But I think the only point I want to make is that you can't simply have international agreements that exist in one sector or one level. Cooperation, I think, is a comprehensive thing. If we cooperate on security and we have a stable world, we can actually work together to deal with these other pressing problems as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parry. And another question is from Munira Bastianelli, who's a senior consultant compliance analyst at United Legs. And his question is, do you anticipate the entire strike group will take part in freedom of navigation operations, or do you think it will split into smaller elements, such as HMS Defender in the Black Sea? Dr. Hayton.
My feeling is that no, I don't think they will. If they do go within, for example, the Paracel Islands, or go within 12 nautical miles of any other features, I don't think it'll be all of them. It would be just a single ship, or maybe a couple of them, I would have thought, would be my guess. I mean, I did hear, was it the first Sea Lord in a speech a couple of years ago say that the UK wasn't particularly focused on sailing within 12 nautical miles of disputed features, that there were in effect kind of other issues that it wanted to bring attention to, such as drawing, straight baselines around groups of islands. So the UK, and Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't really use the language of FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations, in the same way as the Americans. But it will, it may make some kind of symbolic transit, either this time or on the way back. Partly as a sort of gesture, I think, to the US, partly as an assertion of the country's rights under international law, and partly as a signal to all the countries in the region.
Thank you, Dr. Hayton. Dr. Parry.
Yeah, very briefly, I think the UK government's been very busy signalling to China that this is a de-escalatory deployment. We're not going to go through the Taiwan Straits. There's all sorts of things we're not going to do. Just accept we're there. We'll do sort of freedom of navigation through international waters. We won't unduly provoke you, so we don't want any hassle in return. And I think that's the political message that has gone out here. So I think I agree with Bill. There'll be some very low-level penetrations of what I think are fairly basic sort of baseline sort of conditions. We've seen ships of the Royal Navy go through before, and I think the pattern will be repeated. Any single ship that goes anywhere near these features, though, of course, will have extensive top cover. I don't think it's going to be on its own any more than American ships that do FONOPS are already. So if you want to see the pattern of what will happen with the carrier strike group, just have a look at what HMS Albion did in the past. Have a look at some of the other ships. They are de-escalatory, and they signal to the Chinese, in general terms, we don't like what you're doing, but we're not going to sort of dig you in the ribs every time we pass by.
Thank you. Charles Parton, Associate Fellow at the Council on Geostrategy, would like to ask the following question. The UK has a lot of sea to defend, particularly from predatory Chinese fishing fleets, UK waters, Falklands, St. Helena, Caribbean, a few Pacific islands. All have large amounts of water and a need to protect the maritime resources. So should our priority be stationing a couple of ships in the Far East, or should we concentrate our Navy to defend real economic and environmental issues? James.
Sure. I mean, I don't think this is an issue of either or. We have to have the capacity to do both. So yes, the UK does have very large maritime holdings around the world, with its numerous territories scattered around all over the place. So yes, of course, we need to uphold those. But we're not going to uphold those with a carrier strike group. Those will be upheld with patrol ships, smaller vessels, which we have some and are building more of, to undertake these kinds of tasks. So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. We can do both simultaneously. And even though that we're in the Indo-Pacific today with a carrier strike group, that doesn't mean that tomorrow or next month we can't be protecting our assets overseas. The only issue is that, as other countries' navies get stronger, and here not least the People's Liberation Army Navy, we need to review the size of our own Navy and make sure that it's sufficient to the task. But I think even there, the government has acknowledged that the Navy is not really big enough for the tasks envisaged for it in the future. And that is why it has decided to build more escort vessels. So I should imagine and would hope that we would see something similar to this continuing in the future. We might need a bigger Navy still.
Thank you. And the final question is to Ms. Tran. Lucius Coffin, who is studying Master of Science of Politics of Asia at SOAS University, would like to ask the following question. Do you think Britain should be leveraging its position as ASEAN's dialogue partner to help the organization hasten progress in the creation of a long-awaited code of conduct with China for ensuring freedom of navigation?
Yeah, so on this question, we all know that the Chinese has, have been kind of criticizing external partners involving in this process. But, of course, the, more, support will be better for Southeast Asia because compared to China, so, Southeast Asian members, have like disadvantage. But in order, the implementation on how to support them is, I think, is important issue here. How to try the balance between supporting Southeast Asian country and dealing with China at the same time.
James, can I just interrupt? I saw James Parkin was on here asking a question just now. He planned this deployment. I think it's quite important you bring him in if he's still with us. His question's been removed, but actually it was a really good question. But if he's still with us, that would be great.
So his question, I typed an answer and it then moved into the answered column. So it's still there, but it's in the answered list.
Yeah.
I've just found it. So yeah, somehow I missed it because someone answered it already. So let me just read it out now. So Commodore James Parkin, who is the lead officer for planning the deployment at the Permanent Joint HQ Northwood until last week at least, would like to thank you all for a wonderful conversation and discussion. And he's saying that it's very hard to disagree with any of the points raised by the panelists. Although I may not exactly recommend we use the language of Admiral Parry in diplomatic communications. All I would say is that with the ships already in the SCS, we have already seen the first interaction with planned ships, and they have been polite and professional, even courteous. The policy has been to be confident but not confrontational. And our interactions, I hope we will see that we stick to the execution. Chris Parry, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the privileges of being retired is you can say things as they are. James is obviously constrained, but I think he's underlined what I've said. It's de-escalatory. We're going to go about our business as we always do. The Royal Navy will do it anywhere in the world that our politicians need us to do. And that's the benefit, of course, of sea power. You can do it at a time and place of your choice without anybody's permission. And what he said, confident but not confrontational. Yeah, that's what I said, actually. So we agree.
Thank you so much, everyone, and apologies for these technical difficulties today with the Wi-Fi. It's already 2 p.m. and unfortunately we have to end our fascinating discussion, but thank you so much for the panelists and also everyone who attended the event. I hope that you found it interesting and enjoyed it. And I would like to remind everyone that we have kickstarted our events program, and we will be bringing you many more timely and important discussions on geostrategic challenges and environmental security matters in the upcoming months. You can check the upcoming events on our website, and you can subscribe to our events on www.geostrategy.org.uk/subscribe. Thank you very much once again, and see you next time.